Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It is Professor Hamamoto, and the date is March 2nd, year 2025. The time, 4 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. Welcome, one and all, especially the people here in the chat room. As I was waiting to go live, I was looking at some of the comments, and many of you have already started a conversation about this not only provocative topic, but a subject that is really determinant of where we're going as a species, right? It strikes to the heart of the human future. Sometimes it's been characterized as transhumanism, posthumanism. That is the larger issue that I'm going to be grappling with today. But in doing so, I'm going to be talking about what I refer to as this is the phrase, remember it, start using it in your conversation and your correspondence. I'm going to be looking at this larger drift towards the post-human future as being facilitated by militant transgenderism. Militant transgenderism. Transgenderism is not the benign, almost seemingly funny and delightfully entertaining, let's say, divertissement of Drag Race or some of the early comedies where funny gay characters were inserted, right? That was phase one of the normalization process. We are now in the midst of the institutionalization process of GLBTQ plus politics, which now includes transgenderism. Indeed, it might be argued that transgenderism is now at the cutting edge of what used to be called the GLBTQ plus. And most of us who are watching here realize that the GLBTQ plus has been parodied to the point of absurdity. It's because it's been exhausted to the point of absurdity. So in order to maintain the momentum that was built over the past 40 years in academia, because I want to stress first and foremost that these ideas and these practices, these behaviors, and this punitive regime of militant transgenderism has its origins in academic discourse at the university. And this encompasses not only the ideological transgenderism, right? That's a little bit easier to identify, but it also extends to the biotechnical or the biogenetic reordering of human existence, the human species, and society in general. So I'm going to be attempting and in approaching this daunting task is, how do I do this? There's so much material there. So I'm just going to go slow. Instead of putting it all out front, I'm going to go slow. Maybe I'll take this to another talk altogether, a continuation of this discussion, because I can't exhaust it in only 60 or 70 minutes today. Right. So toward that end, I'm only going to be focusing on two primary texts, both of which are linked to at the description here. If you want to purchase the book, I suggest that you read these books more carefully than I'm able to present to you in such a short time, because these are documents, these are permanent documents of this struggle, this life and death struggle that we're going through right now. It's way past Ziggy Stardust, the RuPaul. It's way past the disco era. It's way past orthodox gayness in the films. It's way past Ellen DeGeneres. It's getting into the granular, or let's put it more precisely, to the molecular, to the genetic. Right. So first of all, before I continue, let me show you the primary books that I'm going to be citing here. I have a bunch of other books that you might want to check out. Most of my audience here are very serious people who do a lot of reading, I can tell. They don't just sit and watch YouTube and take some ass clown's word for it, or watch the History Channel and say, oh, yeah, I know all about the occult now. I saw this on, so I won't name any people. Most of those clowns are newbies, and they are pop-up pundits, right? There's a few of them that are good, and I try to highlight their work as opposed to probably about 75% of it is Drek. It's a Yiddish word. Just like chutzpah is a Yiddish word that characterizes someone like Volodymyr Zelensky from Ukraine, right? Which historically, by the way, they're the cousins of the neocons in America. Their ancestors came from the same area, and they came to America and have been grifting ever since. And they're still doing it in the 21st century. So Zelensky's one of their boys. Anyway, that's a separate talk. But here's some of you already have this book I saw from the conversation here. It's called Becoming Brigitte. And it has an interesting attribution. It says, Candace Owens presents. She's got the top line here. Candace Owens presents an investigation by Xavier Poussard. I have to give priority to Xavier Poussard. He's the guy that wrote this book, right? And there's another book prior to this that was published, which you'll see in a moment on the news, published in French. I don't think it's been translated. It should be. A lot of this material that's cited here in this book, by the way, has really, really good detailed endnotes, chapter endnotes or footnotes, and it has a lot of citations in them. So it's not this pop-up pundit type stuff that has flooded the zone, so to speak, of supposed independent research. Most of it is Drek, right? I'm not that person. If you think you're going to learn A, B, C, D, 1, 2, 3, 4 points right down the line in the first 10 minutes of this talk, you should really tune into someone else who does that they're actors, voice actors who do that kind of work. It's all been written out for them, right? This is more of a freestyle rumination, right? Most of you who've been with me for 4 years understand the necessity of my pedagogical approach. It's deeper, it's more profound, and it's long lasting. And it's also directly connected to our survival. The other stuff's entertainment, right? I know I don't have to tell the people who are my regular audience, but I'm getting newer people all the time, and they have the same complaint. Why don't you just get to the point? All right. Why don't you read this book, Becoming Brigitte? You won't. You're going to watch YouTube. It's got some good illustrations for the people who don't like to read. It's got some illustrations in here too, and they're very well reproduced. And there's pretty compelling forensic journalistic evidence. Supposedly, there were documents produced to establish the fact that Brigitte Macron is who she says, or he says, is what he or she is. I'm going to dispense with the pronoun games here and just call her he or she. I'll just use it interchangeably, because the gender he, she aspect of it really is secondary to the larger issue. And this is something that is not covered in this book, and it's not covered in the discussion about this book and about the Candace Owens presentation. And it's the occult forces, historical forces behind this whole aggressive authoritarian transgenderist movement that is threatening to swamp American politics, and it's already turned violent. And it might even turn in a direction towards political assassination. Right? So we're not messing around here. This is not entertainment. This is about the life of the American Republic. And this is about the civil life of the world community, because this is a global operation that is in play, this militant transgenderism. It's in all the Western European countries. We know this. Germany, we're talking about France here, of course. The UK, parts of Central Europe, Eastern Europe, less so. China seems to have rejected it, but there are infiltrators who have been sent back to China to promote the transgenderist agenda. They're usually educated at places like UC Berkeley, and they have these sodomistic relationships with the professors and the handlers and the counselors at the elite institutions from Yale to Berkeley down to Stanford. And once they've been initiated, Knights Templar style, which includes spitting on the cross and kissing the arse of the knight, and sodomy, and the worship of young boys and children, then they are sent back to places like China to put through their agenda. They've made fairly good inroads already in places like South Korea, and even before that, Japan, which I'll get to in a moment. How do I know this? It's manifested in the popular culture. This is what I have specific training in, popular culture. I'm not a newbie in popular culture. Everybody thinks they're an expert on popular culture because they grew up watching television and movies and now new media. So, how tough can that be? And by the way, early popular culture studies was heavily informed by what today is called critical theory, or quote unquote critical or cultural Marxism. Most of the early theoreticians of the so-called culture industry were these people: Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, most of whom have never been read by these people who talk so knowingly about cultural Marxism. I mean, one ass clown wrote in the comment, "I'm not going to listen to you anymore because you read these Marxists." Right? You are at the level of name calling. You are at the name of just kind of laughing. You're like, transgender, queer. Or you're at the levels one step higher of moralists. Oh, it's bad. We shouldn't do that. It's that's moralism. Okay. I'm about understanding the cultural forensics that make up our political realities here. And how do I do that? I do that through a study of history. And for those of you who want a quick fix, a lot of this work, most of it comes from academic literature, not the pop literature that you see being pumped out there left and right. Now, it has its function. I read most of it, and I learn from it too. But that's only the beginning of the study. It's not the end. It's the beginning of it. First of all, before I go on, because I felt I had to scold in advance the newbies who think they know about transgenderism because they watch Candace Owens. She's a pop-up pundit, by the way. I include her as a pop-up pundit. I saw her coming. I saw how she was brought in. People like Ben Shapiro, they always make an appearance on the Alex Jones first, just to see what their Q quotient is, how the public receives them. And then if they pass muster, then they're elevated. They're moved around to Joe Rogan and other supposedly independent news media. And then if there's excitement in the public about that, because they test the audiences, then they'll even give them their own show. And they put big bucks behind it too. So let me just state this. I'll answer my own question. Why is it Candace Owens presents? What's her agenda? Why is she so invested? And everybody does have an agenda, including myself. There is no such thing as objective, value-free social science or any type of science. I was invested with some sort of political interest. I mean, I'm not reducing everything to that, but there's always a motive behind. This is not just dispassionate inquiry, right? Even Tyrone Hayes, who did the investigation of atrazine that resulted in the gay frogs. Yeah, I know all about it now because I had heard about the gay frogs. That's based on serious academic research that came out of University of California, Berkeley. But if you understand his background, Tyrone Hayes, you find out why in particular he went on this research topic focusing on atrazine, which I'll be talking about before we finish this talk here. I'll be talking about the biochemical re-engineering of the human species, right? And that's not the last word either. This is just showing you the breadth, the scope, the depth of this discussion about militant transgenderism. Oh, yes, it goes really deep. And the university and the people who staff it, from the chancellor, the president, to the vice chancellors, the deans, and the professors, and the researchers who are on contract, to Novartis and Syngenta, and to Big Pharma, they need to be held accountable for their crimes against humanity. And I don't think it's going to happen from the Department of Education. Who's the chair there? Her name is McMahon. She's the wife of a guy who's a business friend of Donald Trump, Vince McMahon, I think it is. And I realized why they're so tight. I think it goes back to the Atlantic City casino, right? The Trump Tower, or one of the big venues there. They did a lot of UFC sports there. So they had a pre-existing, and I think he donated a lot of money to the campaign. But we don't have any time to dick around. The Department of Education, needs to start riding herd on these publicly funded and private universities that receive public funds, because they are committing genocide and extending the eugenics program writ large. And there's a danger for all the people who think they know all about eugenics, because I saw a piece on YouTube about Margaret Sanger. Yeah, you know how to name check the right people, but you don't realize that we're still very much locked into this regime of biogenetic engineering. And I've done many talks of this already over the past 4 years. You might want to look at the playlist that I generated. But let me ask my question: why is Candace Owens interested in Brigitte Macron in specific? Well, my guess it's because it's a Roman Catholic intelligence operation. If you might recall, all of a sudden Candace Owens, before she really blew up, became a convert to Roman Catholicism. And she also married a white man from Britain who seemed to have some sort of intelligence connection. And at the same time, you have characters like Russell Brand converting to Roman Catholicism. And I know you're going to say, oh, yeah, of course, it's the Jesuits. Because, again, you've seen all the YouTube presentations on the Jesuits. So you think you know all about it. And you're tuning me out. You're not listening to me because you think you know the operation. And that's, by the way, is why they allow this material on TubeU and X and Twitter, not just so that it becomes normalized and even institutionalized, and it becomes, so what? All right. So this is my guess. It's a hypothesis. I don't have any definitive proof, but I think you can put it together. And in fact, in the book itself, it talks about some of the leaks, some of the releases, some of the journalistic investigations that were done in France were the product of right-wing Catholic journalists and writers. All right. So everybody not everybody, but there's some big interests in here involved in this story. All right. And again, I'll reiterate, I'm not so interested whether Brigitte Macron is a man or a woman. I'm not interested if Big Mike is a man or a woman or any of these other guys. Not interested if Amal Clooney is a cloney of a man or George Clooney is a phony. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in the ritualistic foundations of this mind F, let's put it, this mind game that's being put out there in the public. And it's occult in nature. And I don't have time to go into it. I'll be alluding to, Eliphas Levi and Baphomet, the Church of Satan, all these other expressions of Egyptian or pagan religion, let's say more globally, pagan, because it's not just Africa, it's also in Asia, Mesoamerica, right? You know about the Aztec death cults and the skulls and Templo Mayor underneath Mexico City, which I've been to, by the way. I was watching the excavation of what's called Templo Mayor in the Distrito Federal, Mexico City. They dug up hundreds of thousands of skulls. So in Mesoamerica, the kindly Indians who we romanticize, they was into some serious cannibalism and human sacrifice. So this goes really deep. And in fact, I will say at the outset that this ritualistic enactment of bisexuality or polysexuality harkens back to these pagan rituals that predate Christianity by a millennium or more. And they never, as most of you realize, they never fully went away. In fact, they started to stage a serious comeback around the 1960s or the post-war period. Let's say from the 50s to the 60s, Wicca religion, W-I-C-C-A, in the late 40s and 50s after World War II. You know about your Gerald Gardner and the witchcraft, Anglo-American Britain and America. And before that, you know about the Gothic traditions of the 19th century. There's a whole genre of literature devoted to the Gothic imagination, which draws from this extensive history of paganism that runs through so-called civilized society. And we're going to be looking, or at least alluding to, some of the books in that genre, which I've been reading systematically for the past maybe 10 years or so, maybe more. I can't remember. And I'm telling you this because maybe you'd like to read along, and maybe you'd like to reread the books that we were exposed to in elementary school, but the teacher was unable to or incapable or not allowed to talk about the occult nature of all these supposedly children's classics by people like Jules Verne or Edgar Allan Poe. If you read it with intelligent, educated, adult eyes, you will see all the goodies, the oldies and goodies, in an entirely new light. And you will go, my gosh, I already know this stuff. This is so familiar. Maybe it was done on purpose. I don't know, but I certainly don't recall it. And I had some weird teachers of English. They're, literature teachers in K through 12. And I took a lot of comparative literature as undergraduate. I took a lot of English classes, but maybe one or two, but they didn't make it their focus. Really talked about the occult underpinnings of this literature. And this literature were made into radio programs and then television shows and film over and over again. It's become part of the formula of our popular culture, reaching back to some of these even archetypal stories. So here we have another story, and her life is a fiction, he or she. Emmanuel Macron's life is a fiction. Most of these political figures that we see up there are fictions. They're performances. I'll use the concept drawn from gay studies that's called performance studies. Performance studies was put in the university to take place of traditional theater arts and drama department because performance would be all gay. Because their idea is that gender is not biologically or genetically immutable. It's a performance. It's performativity. That's one of the phrases they like to use. It's live action role play. And I hazard to guess that some of these killers who were running around as part of this transgenderist, militant, violent cult were inspired by a lot of these video games, movies, and literature in forming their own synthetic identity of violent, militaristic transgenderists. Right? We know that, and I've given talks on this already, we know this happened 3 generations ago in science fiction when Ugo Gernsback, also from the remnants of the Habsburg Empire, right? Weimar, I think he emigrated to the US. Ugo Gernsback, the father of science fiction, he's said to have coined the term. He started his own magazine. Philip K. Dick was an avid reader. He had all the back copies of it. It just schooled a whole generation of science. We know that they're queering science fiction. The Future is Female, is an whole anthology published by the Library of Americas because the science fiction community was criticized. It was an Asian woman particularly. She won the award for science fiction of the year. I forgot her name, but she criticized them for being white and racist. Gee, how did she figure that out? And by the way, that's one of the reasons why I could never read science fiction or even watch it, because all the aliens looked Asian. Did you notice that? And the ones who are on science fiction shows like the next Star Trek or even the original Star Trek, like Commander Lieutenant Zulu, they were queer. And the original Star Trek, they didn't make a big deal out of it. But of course, George Takei was put forward in order to put into play the gay agenda for the future cosmonauts. And then John Cho, who was resuscitated as Zulu with George Takei's blessing. I can't do the salute. He was written explicitly as a queer Asian male. And we're going to get to queer Asian males in specific. I'm kind of giving you a foreshadowing, like a really exciting movie. Not Harold and Kumar Escape from Guantanamo Bay, but a real movie with psychological depth, with flash forwards and flashbacks, parallel conversations, interior monologue. This is what you're seeing right here, live, unscripted. So I'm not going to go, mercifully, not going to go through all the different details that are in this fine book that also has an index, I believe. Does it have any? Yeah, it's in, though there's a summary at the back, but it has these extensive footnotes that you can cross-check the material there. And I, of course, took extensive notes. I'm just going to throw them away. I'm not going to look at them. Oh, yeah. Intersex. Are you familiar with the term intersex? I first came across that concept, oh my gosh, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, because because sexuality is one of my areas of expertise, acknowledged not by my peers. I have thousands of citations out there who cite Professor Hamamoto for his work in popular culture, sexuality, and New World Order theory. Those are my 3 biggies. So I found out about 25 years ago this concept of intersects, and it was articulated by a professor at Brown University. Her name is Anne Fausto Sterling. I believe I'm getting the name pretty close. Check it out. Anne Fausto Sterling. And she coined the term of intersex. And this was unique to me. And this is way before the GLBTQ plus agenda was pushed forward. But they took contributions from people like her in order to weaponize this movement, to use it as a political lever to achieve their political agenda, which its end game is transhumanism, or I prefer to call it posthumanism, because there'll be no humanity as we know it. And they brought in all the allied sciences. We already talked about Tyrone Hayes, right, from the evolutionary or the environmental biology field, but in neurobiology, it's super big. It's very well funded. And I know for a fact that all these researchers are scrambling like crazy, worried that their money supply is being cut off by Doge. I'm receiving regular correspondence weekly by university administrators to try to reassure their faculty that they're going to find some way to fund this research that will help take us into the post-gender future. And most of these high-level administrators, do I need to tell you, are LGBTQ or transgender, if not Wiccan. I worked under a Wiccan dean. The only reason they got rid of her is because she got her hand caught in a cookie jar. She was giving money under the table to her fellow lesbian colleagues. And they said, no. If you want to steal, you better do better than that. You got to steal big. I never got along with her, not because she was a Wiccan, not because she was a lesbian, but because she hated me because I'm an Asian man. I'm a heterosexual yellow male. And I'm saying that because heterosexual yellow male aggressive types are being programmed out by the people who run South Korea, the Jaebol, Samsung, SK, those people, and the Zaibatsu who run Japan, Mitsubishi, Toyota, Honda. They're part of the globalist agenda to depopulate their respective societies. And it's going to happen also to India. And I mean, there already are quote unquote birth control, population control programs there. We know that. But on a more aggressive cultural level, they're the globalist WEF type people, the architects of the new post-human future, have these other societies slated for feminization and eventual degenderization. Okay, the second book, see, I've only gotten to the first, and I'll return to these texts. The second major book that I'm looking at is Unmasked. Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. Unmasked. It's by Andy Ngo, NGO. And he's a Vietnamese extraction. I think he's an American citizen. But he is a yellow man. And you might have seen him on the shows, interviewed. First, he was writing about Antifa. But then he realized that once Antifa had run its course by its handlers, transgenders were put into place. They were mobilized in order to start enforcing their violent political agenda on people ranging from a landlord in California. They slashed him up and he shot one of his attackers. He was about to testify against them. Before he was able to do so, he was murdered. We'll see this in a moment. And on the other side of the country, we had a U.S. border guard who was shot in cold blood up in Vermont. And they were part of the same transgender cult. Male to female transgenders. And I will call them a cult because I know people who study cult, sociology of religion and cult, most notably this guy named Massimo, I can't remember his last name, but he's always saying, "Oh, don't call it a cult. Christianity started as a cult. Everything starts at a cult. It's an abused term." Maybe it is abused and overused. And if you're a sociologist of religion and don't want to use the term cult, go ahead. But that's not me, so I'll call it a cult. It is a transgender. Introvine is his name, Massimo Introvine. You can find his articles. I've read most of them. I've read his books too. He's for real, but he's in a really narrow corner of the sociology of religion there. An important figure nonetheless. So let's take a look at what Tucker Carlson and Andy Ngo had to discuss so far as this militant and transgenderism, the change of course that is taking place right now. And I think it's going to get worse, and I think it's going to metastasize to political assassination. Heaven forbid. But this is where it's heading. This is where revolutionary movements in the modern era always wind up, whether it's the French Revolution or the Bolshevik Revolution or the 1930s attempted communist revolution here in the United States, which was mounted, by the way, by these Bolsheviks who were from the Ukraine, the cousins of Vladimir Zelensky, who wound up en masse into New York City and organized labor. A lot of them, then there's another wing of them that became criminals, right? You've heard of Meyer Lansky. There were the criminals and there were the intellectuals that were involved in extortion at the street level. And eventually they were able to go to law school, get elected to political office, and produce people like Chucky Schumer and control the entire system of criminality, which is now being exposed through Doge. All right. So I'm not telling you that this is all inevitable, but it's going nowhere unless we have a larger historical understanding of where all this comes from and where it's heading. So here is Tucker Carlson and Andy Ngo.
No. So in my reporting on Antifa for years now, one observation that I noticed was that disproportionately the number of riot arrestees are gender diverse. And by that, I mean they don't identify with their biological sex. On some nights, it was as high as 20%, and that is magnitudes higher than what the data we have on people in the wider American population who are trans-identifying. So, I looked into this a bit further. There's some peer-reviewed research out of Canada. You can find it on the Library of Medicine that shows that there's evidence that young transgender people are particularly vulnerable to violent radicalization. And in my reporting on left-wing extremism, for months now, I've documented and tracked this surge in violent rhetoric by self-identified trans militant activists, particularly on Twitter, in response to various states restricting or banning the medical transitioning of minors. As you mentioned earlier, the horrific murder of children and staff at the Christian school yesterday does come just days ahead of a so-called Trans Day of Vengeance that's being organized in the U.S. Capitol. And unfortunately, myself and other people who have reported on this and posted this flyer, which, by the way, that group is still online. If you posted the flyer, regardless of the context, you're locked out of your account. So currently, I cannot access my Twitter.
Can I ask you just a quick macro question? So one of the reasons that so many well-meaning middle-aged moms in this country have bought into support of the trans community is on the basis of the promise that it's liberation and this is kids, when they finally express their true inner identity, will be happier and better adjusted. But the incidence of violence and mental illness seems to be extraordinary. So it doesn't seem like people are being liberated. It seems like people are being tormented and driven to the brink of insanity. That, just watching, that seems clear.
It's the exact opposite of liberation. We have mountains of evidence that people who suffer from gender dysphoria also suffer from very high rates of mental health comorbidities. When you have this reality on top of people being fed cross-sex hormones and are also being in an environment where they are encouraged to have a violent hatred of wider society, and you can see this in the reaction before, during, and after this this killing.
And where's this violent hatred of America and of society and of the world, the straight world, the cisgender world, that's their term? Where does it originate, and where is it fomented? Where is it cultivated, massaged, and weaponized? It's the university, ladies and gentlemen. That's not news to you, but most of us feel that it's some sort of sanctuary. Right, you would no sooner go into a church and start arresting a bunch of illegal immigrants than would you go on a campus and start shutting down this type of activity. And it's not just these isolated Antifa transgender types that are doing it. It's the counselors. It's the so-called psychotherapists who are now embedded amongst the faculty. They're hiring more psychotherapists than they're hiring tenure-track professors. The people who were otherwise slotted for teaching positions are now recruited to go out in the streets as lecturers to be the shock troops for organizations like Antifa and BLM. Most of those people there that are misidentified as professors are teaching assistants or research assistants or lecturers. And they're trying to earn their bones by showing how down they are with the transgender authoritarian cult by being out in the street, leading a bunch of gullible undergraduates into acts of violence. And Andy Ngo is not just talking about being yelled at. He was beat down mercilessly in 2019. He suffered brain damage. And then in 2021, again, he was attacked, he was recognized, and he was beaten down again in 2021. This is in the second edition of this book. In the afterword, if you read the hardback version, it only goes up so far, but the afterword, it concludes with this intensification of the violence. And he's a civilian, he's a journalist, ostensibly left liberal even. I don't even think he was a conservative, an arch conservative journalist. He wasn't hanging out with the so-called Proud Boys, which, by the way, I'm very suspicious of the origins of Proud Boys. Proud Boys is not, it's like a Candace Owens situation. It's not organic. It's an AstroTurf organization. Now, the guy, Enrique Torrio, that was thrown into prison, he might be innocent of that history. Okay, I'm not saying that he knows this stuff, but Proud Boys was started by this Canadian guy named Gavin McGuinness, who is a racist against yellow people, against Asian people. Gavin, he's Canadian. He lives in America with his American Indian wife, supposedly, who is her family. They're all involved in intelligence. And he gets a lot of play on conservative, independent media. So I'm trying to express to you the subtleties of all these different people who are out there putting out information and disinformation. The fake heroes and the fake dialectics that are whipping us back and forth. And I will call on their names, and I'll ask you to do the research yourself and find out who these characters are. Look into their family. It's easier than ever to find this type of material out. A lot of this research on Brigitte Macron was done by citizen journalists. I know that term's overused, and I don't like to invoke it because there's a lot of people who call themselves citizen journals out there who have zero credibility, right? And but they get a lot of play. They get a lot of play. So check this one out. In the third book that I cited here in the description that you want to, this is more of an academic book, so it's more ponderous, let's call it, and but it's called Nazi Occultism, subtitled Between the SS and Esotericism, and it's by a French professor. He teaches in Belgium. His name is Stéphane François, and it's translated. This is an academic book, right? His job is to trying to shape the discussion about Nazism on YouTube and in the popular culture, and to disabuse of us. And many of his arguments are sound and valuable. Right? I'm not dismissing it entirely, but he's trying to minimize through the force and the efficacy and the political meaning of Nazi occultism in today's political discourse. He just says this is a right-wing cultic expression of politics, and he gives a good historical exposition about how right-wing Nazism or movements in general, how they arise. We understand that. But he would deny that organizations, can't speak for him, but I think he would deny the assertion, and I'll own it myself, the assertion that people like these militant, authoritarian transgenderists are an extension of Nazi occultism, even though they're on the left, right? You all know there's a really thin line that divide right-wing extremists from left-wing extremists. It's political extremism when you get down to it. So I'm reading, the reason why I'm looking at this book, because he's going through very methodically and carefully in his definition what the occult is and what Nazism is. He's very careful with the definitions. He doesn't just throw them around indiscriminately, right? But one of the salient features, many, more than one, there are a few salient features of occult Nazism that are very much part of the militant transgenderist cult responsible for these recent murders. One of them is veganism. And as George Carlin reminds us, Hitler was a vegetarian. I think so was Heinrich Himmler. He had a background in agriculture, agronomy. I think he was a specialist in chicken farming. I mean, they loved nature. They loved the Wandervogel. They loved the young men stripped halfway down to their shorts, hiking through the land, the motherland, through the blood and through the soil. Physical excellence, the whole Aryan trip, the whole Aryan death trip. It's there, and it's also there in the militant transgenderism, right? And people like Milo Yiannopoulos, since we're calling out all the people ostensibly who are on our side, your Candace Owens, your Gavin McGinnis, let's throw in Milo Yiannopoulos. Remember him? That mother is not even American. What does he have to say about American politics and culture? Nothing. He was brought out as a provocateur. And in this book here on Mass, they talk about how he was shut down when he made an appearance at UC Berkeley. He was supposed to give a talk for the College of Republicans, I believe, but Antifa or the mob shut him down. Now, was that right? No, not at all. But what this book doesn't capture is that the day before Milo Yiannopoulos went to Berkeley, and it was covered by all the news media, he made sure of that. His people made sure that he was going to be spotlight, and he had private security too, by the way. The innocent bystanders, the undergraduates who are just out there in the quad to see what's going on, who accidentally get beanbagged or gassed, or get their eye put out because they happen to be the wrong place. They didn't have any protection, but Milo Yiannopoulos did. But the day before he went to Berkeley, guess where he was? He was at my campus. He was at UC Davis. It's 1 hour east of Berkeley. Just take the I-80 and you're into Berkeley. And he was also shouted down by these student activists who are mostly teaching assistants, research assistants, and junior professors without tenure who will never get tenure. So they have to earn their initiation fees by rabble rousing, because they can get the undergraduates to put pressure on the faculty to hire them back as lecturers or even for tenured positions. It's called extortion. This is what labor unions do to get whatever they need out of capital. And am I pro-capital? No, not at all. They do the same thing. They have their secret police. They have their Pinkertons. So that was my, Andy No cannot know all this material. I don't expect him to, right? And I don't expect him to understand women's studies. And it's not called women's studies, and it's called women and gender studies now. That is the true locus of this violent, authoritarian, transgenderist ideology. It's women and gender studies. Yes, it does come out of critical theory. Yes, it is influenced by Marxism, but so-called cultural Marxism is no longer the big bugaboo that keeps being repeated. It's gender studies. And if the Department of Education really wants to make a difference at the inculcation of 18-year-olds with transgenderist ideology, and in combination with big pharma, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, 75% of which are women, by the way. That's the real atrocity being directed against women. It's the SSRIs. They're drugged out. And also men, especially men with supposed quote unquote gender dysphoria. They're on the meds too. Maybe there should be some funded research on the connection between SSRIs and violence. I know some of this stuff will give you quote unquote suicidal ideations. That's a nice way of saying they want to themselves. But it could be there's maybe homicidal ideations as well. So let's turn to some living examples of this global transgenderist revolution, right? Not just in America, just for comparative research purposes, right? That's where I got my doctorate in comparative culture. I looked at different cultures to see how one particular society organizes itself versus another. And now we're seeing that there's an all-encompassing global post-human society that's being brought into being, of which violent transgenderist ideology is a component right here and now as we speak. So here's how it played out in South Korea. And it started way back in the 50s during the occupation of Korea Peninsula under the pretext of the Korean War, where they divided North and South. That division remains today, which keeps all the retired generals and colonels fully employed, double dipping at the military contractors, the ones that Doge is finding out about. They need South Korea for that purpose, but they also need it to help serve as a laboratory, a biogenetic laboratory for humanity 2.0, as they call it. Next stage, next level humanity, which is queer, which is beyond queer, it's post-gender. South Korea is a laboratory for that. And it started with the American occupation of South Korea. And it is still occupied. There's 40, 50,000 troops in South Korea. South Korea is one of the largest recipients of quote unquote foreign aid from the U.S. taxpayer. Israel's at the top, way up there, but South Korea is down there as well. But we can't feel bad about South Korea because they have all those cute girls at the baseball games doing the peeky peeky dance. And we have all those cute girl men who are K-pop stars. Speaking of which, let's take a look. I'm sure it makes all the rice queens so excited to see these types of videos. Those guys in Hollywood, quote unquote, who like young, fresh Asian men. Their favorite item on the menu is called Some Young Men.
10 most handsome K-pop male in 2024. Top 10 most
I thought it's appropriate to show it as a AI narration of a Indian techie. Yeah, they look like women, right? And not long from now, we won't even use that designation. It'll just be so normalized. We won't think of it in terms of that's man, that's woman, that's male, that's female. That's K-pop, ladies and gentlemen. K-pop is a monopoly. It's a state-level corporate / state monopoly run by a small group of social engineers. And it's global in its scope now. And you know, of course, that the similar phenomenon was preceded by J-pop. The same phenomenon. They said, hey, it worked in Japan. Let's move it to South Korea. Pretty soon you're going to see it happening in Vietnam. You've already seen it in Thailand with the underground sex culture of the Katai, and in Philippines, girly men, transgenders. A lot of the pharmaceuticals about hormone disruption, endocrine medication, a lot of those were beta tested in Thailand, where they have the girly men, where all the perverts from Europe and the United States, people like Gary Glitter, go there to have sex with transgenders. This is all biopharmaceutical experimentation, and it's become part of the culture there. And they have children who are raised by families now to go into that industry, the Katai industry, because that's the source of the income for the family. See how it's related to these larger movements of capital and the larger agenda of the World Economic Forum and other related globalist entities. So you're learning about Japan. Did you know that Japan is heavily invested in the popular culture, in the whole transsexual culture, the transsexual revolution? This came to my attention in reading a manga. Right, it's Japanese graphic novels, in case you don't know. This is back in 1980s that I was reading this. Excuse me a second. And I found this translated manga in a Japanese pop culture shop on the campus of UC Irvine. They had Japanese movies, music, manga, all of this. This is before the big J-pop craze took place. So, I wrote a paper about Japanese popular culture way back in 1976 when I was with Bowling Green State University. And I said, this is going to be big. But this was in the 80s. Some years afterward, I found the book, Ranma One Half by Takahashi Rumiko. And later it was made into an anime. And let me show you the clip here. See if you can guess what the subtext is of a Ranma One Hafu. Of course, it's on Netflix, the big social engineering firm down here in Silicon Valley. Ranma One Half, it makes transgenderism into kawaii. That means cute, right? So it's the full spectrum. We have kawaii culture, and we have a violent transgenderism of these people who are executing certain targets of heteronormativity in the attempt to destroy what they call heteropatriarchy, smash patriarchy. And it goes to ridiculous lengths. I was in a Vietnamese restaurant, of all places, in Oakland, right? Oakland is right next to Berkeley, the East Bay, and that's why the whole city has gone downhill. Across the way, you've got San Francisco. The city's gone downhill, right? The people at Berkeley and that live in the Berkeley Hills and people live in Nob Hill, they escape it. They're waiting to destroy the city down below so they can buy it up for pennies on the dollar and gentrify the whole area. But I was in Oakland at a Vietnamese restaurant, and I went to a urinal just to show you how thoroughgoing this type of revolutionary struggle against heteropatriarchy is. I walked up to a urinal, and there was a sticker in there, and it said, "Smash patriarchy." And I took a picture of it. I had my camera with me. I took a picture of it and shared it with my table mates. And, they're all, progressive type, East Bay, Oakland type, but even they thought it was kind of weird. Anyway, just as a side anecdote. Speaking, since we're talking about East Bay, we'll go to UC Berkeley and see the research of Professor Todd Haynes. Now, the people who are pro-transgenderism don't want to talk about the biogenetic connection. And if you want to see articles on that, I have put it in my Patreon. I also encourage you to look at my X account because I put some of the full excerpts there that you can watch at your leisure. I can't do it all right now. It would take couple hours to show all that stuff. So go to the X account, go to the Patreon to look at some of these articles. Such articles as, let me read it real quick. These are from academic journals. This is academic research. Comes from the Journal of Exotoxicology and Environmental Safety. The title is Glyphosate Presence in Human Sperm. First report in positive correlation with oxidative stress in the infertile French population. All right. That article is going to be in my Patreon. So the other one is in the American setting here. Environmental contaminants, endocrine disruption, right? Gender dysphoria, you heard about it. And transgender, it says, can, born that way, in some cases, be toxicologically real? That's the question they posed to themselves. And this appeared in the Human and Environmental Toxicology Journal, right? So the research is there, but your militant transgenderists will not admit to it, that they're the product, their behavior is the product of the SSRIs and the environmental toxins and neurotoxins that have been fed into them probably since birth. And the ways that they're able to put that into the system, right? I don't want to say the word because I want this this video to stay up so people can watch it and learn from it. But Professor Todd Haynes does not, he's number one, he's black. Okay. So he's got a little bit of wiggle room because of his race. Plus, he does not look heteronormative. You know, he might even, his behavior, he might even be kind of sweet. You know, you don't know. So he gets a pass on that. But even he, Dr. Todd Haynes, says, hey, we got some problems with atrazine. This is where you heard about the gay frogs. It's Professor Todd Haynes who came up with that laboratory research. He's got the receipts. But what I'm saying here is that a lot of this behavior here and the transgenderist politics that are being rolled out aggressively against us is a outward manifestation of a larger re-engineering of the human species at a very basic level. So let's take a look at this journalistic piece.
With a disturbing scientific saga that demonstrates how far some will go to control what version of science gets told and how that could factor into emerging trends in human sexuality. 25 years ago, a researcher stumbled across what could be an important piece of the puzzle, but powerful forces have worked to silence and smear him, making it harder to get at the facts all these years later when they could matter the most.
So here's where we do molecular work. So
We caught up with Tyrone Hayes in his lab at University of California, Berkeley, where he's a professor of integrative biology.
So I am a developmental endocrinologist. That means I'm interested in the role of hormones in regulating development.
For our purposes, you can think of him as the frog professor. In 1998, Hayes was a young assistant professor when he got hired to conduct research for pharmaceutical and chemical giant Novartis.
I was contracted by what was then Novartis to study atrazine, an herbicide, and to figure out if that herbicide somehow interfered with hormonal regulation of development.
Atrazine is routinely used on corn crops, sugarcane, pineapple, sorghum, macadamia nuts, and evergreen tree farms. And it's one of the most common contaminants in America's drinking water. In 1998, the government had announced a safety review that could have led to atrazine being restricted or banned. Novartis was hoping Hayes' research would help them prove it's safe.
At the time, it was the #1 selling product for Novartis. It was their #1 selling agrochemical.
And what did you learn early on?
Early on, we showed that atrazine both what I deemed demasculinized animals as well as feminized animals. So genetic males should develop testes and a certain type of larynx or voice box for attracting females. That aspect was inhibited, and those genetic males oftentimes developed ovaries and actually transformed into females.
Not only did atrazine turn boy frogs into girls, Hayes discovered, some atrazine-exposed frogs also developed both male testes and female ovaries. But it's what the research implied about people that was most concerning.
Okay, I put this on my X account so you can watch the report. It's a good one. I think that's Cheryl Atkinson, if I'm not mistaken. An incredibly good journalist. You could watch it on X, and you could probably find, if you want to do a research paper on this yourself about Dr. Hayes's contributions, I think you can find his papers out there in the interweb, right? So this is a serious problem, and the University of California is doing right by allowing him to do the research. But they're not doing the right thing in being an adjunct of companies like Syngenta and Novartis and Monsanto. The University of California, especially where I was, UC Davis, which is the agricultural station for the University of California, they were owned lock, stock, owned lock, stock, and barrel by these big pharma firms. So if RFK Jr. really wants to make America healthy again, they're going to have to collaborate with the Department of Education to shut these operations down. right? And the women and gender studies departments are there to run interference, which is what interference for a biogenetic mass experimentation that the Nazis could only dream about. That's happening now in 2025. And the violent expression of Antifa, right, the violent transgenderists, are in a way a distraction from the larger intellectual violence that's being perpetrated on your average undergraduate at the university. And they're also in turn being trained to go into these fields to replicate, reproduce, and even do original research and pushing forth this post-human agenda. Now, are you going to be hearing that from this other pop-up pundit by the name of Professor Brett Weinstein? No, you're not. Portland State University. And I mention that because a lot of the action that No was dealing with was centered around Portland State. You know, I wouldn't be surprised if he's not an actor himself. Him and his brother. He's a leftist. He's a quote unquote left progressive. Right? But they had to pull him out to run interference just like they did with the Canadian dude, Jordan Peterson. Another pop-up pundit. By the way, I gave an interview to a smaller channel and they wanted to have me on as a guest with Professor Brett Weinstein. And he wrote them back and they CC'd me the copy of the memo. And they said, no, I don't want to be on debate Professor Hamamoto. He was on Alex Jones. I guess he did his research. I was on Alex Jones. I was the first academic out of the chute to talk about what I call the weaponization of multicultural education. Now it's called DEI. That was me. So I have a copy of that message. That's Brett Weinstein. And then more recently, he was on Alex Jones' show interviewing him. He was kissing Alex Jones' ass like you wouldn't believe. So this is my world, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to it. All right. I'm glad to share some of these anecdotes with you. I have many, many more to come. Right. Payback is a bitch. And so are these characters that I mentioned also. Right. Thank you very much for putting up with me. I am so mean-spirited at times, but I'm trying to get the message out in the most effective way possible. Now, let me ease up a little bit. I could recommend this book. Oh, this woman could have been watching my YouTube for the past 4 years from what I've read. But this is more of a popular accounting of what I was talking about today. But I think it would be a good book to start with. And it's by a writer by the name of Rachel Wilson. And it's called Occult Feminism, The Secret History of Women's Liberation. And I've given several talks on that on this here channel. I talked about Phoebe Hearst, one of the big benefactors of the University of California, married to George Hearst, the mining magnate who spawned the Hearst dynasty, including William Randolph and later even Patty Hearst. That's Fannie Hearst. She was an occultist. She brought that worldview. She was not a Christian. She brought that worldview to the University of California. Further down south at Stanford, you got the same situation there. With Leland Stanford's wife, she was also an Orientalist. She was into Vedanta and Hinduism and so-called Eastern religions. That was at Stanford. That was supposed to be one of the main thrusts of undergraduate education at Stanford until they were bought out by the Pentagon and they were turned into a center for advanced New World Order science and technology. at Stanford. So you have two major institutions not far from each other that I'm quite familiar with and am a part of, whose metaphysical origins are in the American occult tradition. And that's going to have to wait for another lecture or two. My ambition sometime this year is to go through my whole collection of Gothic literature, Anglo-American and Irish, and that means US, literature, starting with people like Sheridan Le Fanu. I always get the academic editions because the footnotes are very helpful, and the introductory essays are really, really key in contextualizing these books, these novels, these short stories, these fictions, because these fictions contain the seeds of what we're seeing here, this militant transgenderism. The final story in this collection here by Sheridan Le Fanu is called Carmilla. It was published in 1872 in Britain, and it's the first real major piece of fiction, which is about, he didn't call it transgenderism, which is about these sexual identity issues. And it wasn't until 25 years later that Bram Stoker, the Irish writer, wrote Dracula, which is also very much about gender dysphoria and human and non-human and blood. Blood looms large in their metaphysics, from blood sacrifice. That's very much at the core of many Mesoamerican societies, Asia, Africa, Anglo-America. It seems to be a cultural universal. But that changed around 2,000 years ago when there was a revolution called Christianity began to take hold and saying, no, laying out commandments about basic human behavior. Why do you think Christianity is under aggressive attack at the same time at this point in history? Because it's all of a piece. So do your background. You'll be richly rewarded if you do your background reading. There's a reason why people are dropping their Netflix subscriptions, because it's boring when the reality of what's taking place in our society, culture, and our political system right now is far more exciting. We're all waiting with bated breath for the next press conference being held by Donald Trump or J.D. Vance, or we'd like to hear from Kash Patel sometime soon, Pam Bondi. That's more exciting than Netflix. So they put themselves out of business, ironically, by trying to capture our imagination, our behavior, and to occupy our intellectual space. We, ladies and gentlemen, have been ensorcelled. That is, the sorcerer came and cast their magic spell on us. We were ensorcelled, but the spell is broken. And it was broken by tons of legitimate, independent journalists, investigators, not very many people in academia. I'm one of the few. But there'll be more to follow because it's cool and it's productive and it's real. It's for real, baby. All right. I'm glad to leave us on such an upbeat note. The spell is broken. It's now time to embrace our new reality. Our history is for us to make, to shape, to direct. That's the message I have for you today. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'll be back with you next week, God willing. Bye.